This is a brief lecture for the Introduction to Music class. We just finished the Baroque period, and I wanted to get into the classical period, or the classical style, as it's listed. So I'll be posting this along with the PowerPoint and some of the some video examples and some of our work. But I wanted to sort of set this up a little bit. In coming from the Baroque, we spoke about Bach and Handel rather extensively. And Bach and Handel were the primary influences. Now, I don't exactly know how to say this without sounding silly, but I left out a lot of people because after the Renaissance, you had a whole new wave of composers, artists, whether it be painting or music or instrumental playing, piano. The pianoforte will become important, but the harpsichord, I mean to say, and the organ were primary instruments that people were using. But they began to develop groups, not quite a full symphony orchestra, but ensemble groups. And the Renaissance ended with the Protestant Reformation. It put an end to it. A lot of you missed that point because of the wars. And so after that, we moved into the Baroque period. Now, in the Baroque period, there is this somewhat mending of a uneasy truce between the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, and the countries that followed Roman Catholicism and the countries that followed the Protestant movement. Pretty much divided into like a north and south thing in Europe. They had to do that because they were under threat of the Muslims that were invading and coming in. So we come into this Baroque period, and I want you to grab this idea of a pendulum swinging back and forth. In the Middle Ages, the church was a heavy influence, but then in the Renaissance, it swung over to a more secular influence. Well, it seems like culture is always a response, and just the way that the Middle Ages was a response to the decadence of the Roman period, the Renaissance was a response to the Middle Ages. Middle Ages kept things rather static and sort of maintained the status quo with a heavy church influence, whereas the Renaissance began to open things up for people. And it was literally an attempt to be more free in expression. Well, don't misunderstand when I talk about the church and stuff. The church will maintain an influence. It'll still be the most prominent influence for Europe. But now it's going to be divided into Protestant church and Catholic church. The music of the day, if you go back and we talked about the motet and the madrigal, it's divided into secular and sacred. So we come forward and you met Handel, who Handel started out as a primarily secular musician, pretty much an entrepreneur, making a lot of money working for the various courts. And then there was Bach, who was just the opposite. Two guys that were so much alike and yet opposite in their spiritual nature. Bach was all into sacred music. He wrote secular music, some, but his primary goal was to write sacred music. So you got these two guys, each filling out the other. Bach was, well, I don't know, he was a little uneducated because he didn't have his degree, whereas Handel had a degree and got honorary degrees. Bach always felt a little inferior, but his music, he was probably one of the greatest musicians that this world's ever known. So we move into the classical period. Now, there's a guy named Franz Joseph Haydn, which you'll see. He's almost a bridge from the Baroque to the classical, because in his early years he was writing in a Baroque style, but then he created a three-part style, and he is the father of that. But what makes classical different from the Baroque is this. The Baroque was all about ornamentation and fancy stuff. The classical period, if the Baroque is over here, the classical period swings back over here. And now it's more about secular music. And in that secular ideology, it was about simplicity. That idea comes from none other than the Renaissance idea of simplicity. we're back to an interest in the Greek culture, the Greek ideas of simple line and form. Um, the philosophy, however, was way more complex. They take the idea of humanism, as the Renaissance did, and they build on it. And then during this period, you'll have some of the things such as the age of enlightenment, or what they call the age of reason. This is where men, and don't misunderstand, they're not rejecting God. They're simply looking back at humanism as it was and thinking, well, God gave us this ability. We should explore it further, and we should use it. And so they began to reason through things. Now that came through Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton gave us the three laws of dynamic and pretty much the scientific method, where he used reason to think through things. This will be a threat to the church. But like I said, the church is still active, and the church is still one of the main influences in people's lives. You have traditional faith in the church, and the new ideas sort of challenge it a little bit. There is a promotion of science, intellectualism, healthy skepticism of some of the supernatural aspects. And that's, today we see that a lot, where people say, well, the church is more mythology and the church causes problems. That healthy skepticism is turned into a sort of a viral skepticism today. And you see more atheists and more agnostics today, because they look back and think, well, the church is the problem. There is no God, there is no devil, it's just us. That starts here with this reasoning and the scientific method. And that really is the beginning of where science and faith come into conflict with one another. We go back to Descartes again, the cogito sum, I think, therefore I am. They dredge him up again and think, well, here's a guy who dealt with reality, and he's telling us what is real. And what is real is the truth, simple and beautiful. They go all back to the 12th century to Occam's razor and bring that forward. I won't explain Occam's razor. But the humanistic ideas of reason become an attack on the clergy, which the clergy doesn't like. But they've learned better than to fight it too much. So they all work together for this idea, this humanistic idea of the empowerment of man. And that's one of the things about the classical period. Now, during this period, by the way, something else is happening. As people are reasoning and thinking, and you know this if you study your history, they begin to rebel against some of these old ideas. And some of the old ideas they rebel against is the idea of nobility and royalty. Why can't everybody be equal? And this spawns the Age of Revolution. This period, by the way, if you look at your dates, I didn't even mention the dates, but 1750 to 1820, during that period is when you have the American Revolution, the French Revolution, you have Napoleon coming to power, throwing down all these royal houses. So it's a pretty much a period of upheaval. Now, the themes of this are more humanistic. You will have things like you come up with heroes and the concept of liberty and égalité, fraternité in France, but patriotism here in America. With that, you have this idea of, well, the common man is not so common. Man is a great thing. And so, just like in the Renaissance, they want to reach out to the quote common man and lift him up. Empowerment of mankind. Music is a way to do that, because now the audience is large. You can still go to a palace and see an artist perform for the king, but you can go right down the street to a pub and see some of the same music being performed in a bar for some people. Mozart is one of the best examples of that. We'll talk about him more, but Mozart would write an opera and play it for the king, and then do what's known as an opera buffa. He'd spoof his own work and then take it down to the local bar and play it. He did that with Don Giovanni, and the people loved it, because it's like, here's Mozart for the royalty, here's Mozart for the common man, and he was making money. There's also Thomas Paine, who writes, I'm looking at his creed. There's a couple of things I wanted you to notice. I put this in here just to give you an idea of what was going on in the mindset, and I'll read some of it. He starts off, he says, I believe in one God and no more. So there's his nod to religion. He says, I believe in the equality of man. I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy. All this sounds good. It's not staying away from the church, and it's empowering the human being. Uh, Further on down in the paragraph, he says, all national institutions of churches, whether Jewish, Christian, Turkish, that's Muslims, appear to me no other than human inventions set up to terrify and enslave mankind and monopolize power and profit. There's where he gets off the reservation, so to speak, because the church, they were going fine with the first part, but then he starts getting into not believing in the creeds and the confessions of the churches and feels that they are using men. Believe it or not, that's not far from what was true. The church had become more of a political institution rather than an entity for love and kindness and the gospel, and Paine was pointing that out. But he also wrote a lot of things about freedom that inspired people to rebel. The music of this period, just like the science of this period, begins to show a lot more sophistication, and it's simply reflecting what's going on in the culture. Now, with this, you have three composers. And again, in the Baroque, I left out just tons and tons of people that were great composers that added a lot to the period. Here, I'm going to focus on three composers. There were many, many more. I'll drop a few names, but the three that I want to primarily focus on is Franz Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Mozart and Ludwig Beethoven. Now, you're probably familiar with at least two of the three. I've even got a video that I want you to watch. It's a biography of Mozart, because of the three, I think Mozart is probably the most important as far as musical development. Now, people would argue that. Haydn was called Papa Haydn because he was a teacher to so many. He developed a three-part form which became universal. It was the early symphony form, and form now becomes as important as the actual melody and harmonies that we use. But Haydn gave it a three-part. It's called ABA, or ternary form, three-part form. Haydn was also someone who became under the patronage of the wealthiest family in Europe, the Esterházys. Patrons were someone who will take in artists, let them live in their palaces, provide clothes, food, salary for them, and even housing. But that comes with an almost slave-like attitude that you're under their control. You can't have a life of your own. If you want to take your family on a picnic and the noble says, no, I want you to bring your ensemble and play for my lunch, guess what you do? Family stays, you go play, picnic another day. Like I said, it's almost a form of slavery, but it's a well-paid slavery. Haydn liked it. The people after him, Mozart and Beethoven, neither one wanted patronage. Mozart wanted only one patron. He wanted to be the court composer. He thought, well, if I'm going to serve someone, I'm going to serve the most powerful person in Europe, because Mozart thought he was the greatest musician in Europe. And arguably, maybe he was. Beethoven didn't want any patrons at all. He threatened to leave Vienna, and some businessmen got together and said, hey, if you'll stay, we'll cover all your expenses. Just stay here and write your music. You don't have to take orders. We're not your patrons. We're just endowing you with the comfort to compose, because they didn't want to lose another great composer. They lost Mozart, and you'll hear about that later. But we start with Haydn. Mozart went to study with Haydn, and Haydn found him to be a child prodigy, and basically said, I think the quote, and I think it's in the biography, Haydn said that he didn't know any musician alive or dead that was as good as Mozart, and Mozart was actually better than he was. And he was a child. He went to school in Italy, leading music school, and within 2 weeks he came out with a degree. He was composing at the age of 8. He was actually composing at the age of 5, but he couldn't write, so his father had to write it down. He was, as the school said, a freak of nature that God allows to be born. But I'm not going to tell you a whole lot about Mozart, because you've got this film. What I do want to point out about Mozart is he took the idea of Haydn's three-part form and turned it into the Classical Symphony form. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. The other guy is Beethoven. Beethoven actually met with Mozart at one point. Didn't study with him because Beethoven felt like he was good or better. Mozart was dying. Beethoven was 16 years old when he met Mozart, and Mozart said, watch this kid. In other words, he sort of Haydn passed the mantle of greatest composer to Mozart. Mozart passes it to Beethoven. They all three knew each other at one time. Well, I don't know if Beethoven knew Haydn, but at least he knew Mozart, who knew Haydn. But Beethoven's interesting. I thought about putting a video of his, but it's too long and it's very complex. But when you study Beethoven, you find a guy that's considered one of the greatest musicians of the world. But look at their work. Mozart wrote over 600 pieces, and I don't mean short pieces, large stuff, 49 symphonies. No, pardon me, Mozart wrote that. Mozart was a prolific composer. Beethoven wrote one opera, 9 symphonies, and the rest of his time he was writing piano pieces and stuff like that. So by output, you should say, well, Beethoven really wasn't that much of a guy. I mean, he didn't do that much. But what he did do was like just top notch. Beethoven will take Haydn's symphony form, that ternary form, turn it into the major classical symphony form. I said Beethoven again, I'm sorry. Let me start that sentence over. Mozart takes Haydn's form, turns it into the classical symphony form. Then Beethoven takes Mozart's form and adds to it. So he sort of embellishes what Mozart saw as perfection. We see it today as the ultimate symphonic form, and that's what's important. These guys will give us a form of writing music that is still used today, and it's used in everything. You can listen to a rock and roll song, and if you break it down to analyzing the form, you will find that it has the same form that these guys created. You've heard the phrase, well, that guy was ahead of his time. Mozart was ahead of his time. The only thing about it is we haven't caught up with Mozart yet. The people who are writing symphonies today have tried to bypass him, outdo him, come up with something totally new, and they have, but they haven't come up with anything better. Nothing has replaced the Mozart form. So basically, Mozart was a 17th century guy, or pardon me, 18th century guy writing for who knows when, because we're still using the 21st century. So what it is about that form, it's called a sonata form, whereas you had an ABA, 3-part form. Mozart changes the names. His A section, he will call them. There's a slide, I think it's slide 9 if you want to know where I'm at on this. But you'll see it. He takes the A section, calls it the exposition. The B section he calls development. C section he calls recapitulation. Now, there's a 4th section called the Coda, but a lot of people think Mozart didn't do that Beethoven added the Coda. Because what you have in the 3-part sonata form, the exposition, development, and recapitulation, is a perfect use of the number 3. You have 3 forms. In each one of the forms, you have 3 parts in that form. So it's like 3 squared, and then 3 squared again, 3 squared again. You have like an exposition. That's the first part. In the first part, you have a theme, a modulation, and then a second theme. In the development, you have the first theme again with some alterations, a modulation of new keys, and then an experimental variant section or verity section. In the recapitulation, you have the exposition all over again. You get the first theme, its original key, then you get a bridge to a new transition, and then that second theme. And each of those may have a closing section, which some people say, well, that's a 4th section, but actually the closing is just sort of an addition to the second section or 3rd section. And then the Coda came along, and like I said, most people think Beethoven added the Coda because all it is sort of a section to express and do what's known as cadenza, which is just a flowery improvisation section, which doesn't fit with Mozart. But that form is what you'll find today in modern music. This is called the Classical Symphony, by the way, and it becomes the primary form of the period. Slide 10 talks about that time. And it talks about how the classical symphony under Beethoven grew up into something totally new. You had 4 movements in the Beethoven Symphony, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th movement. Each one follows a certain form. There is the sonata form in the 1st movement, but that's Mozart. Then there is a dance movement, a lyrical dance in the 2nd, then a faster dance in the 3rd, and then the 4th, it's a bigger, heroic, fast dance. So Beethoven was thinking dance music. But that's the Classical Symphony. From there, I stop with the classical. Now, I know I'm moving really fast. I'm talking really fast. But I want you to look at this PowerPoint and read through it and realize I've got some terms at the end and definitions. That's where your test will come from. I also have the film of Mozart's life, and so if I can, I may put in a little fact sheet on that if I don't use it as a secondary test, I may put some of the questions on the test. I haven't decided. I'm going to do that tonight, as a matter of fact. But this will be the classical period. It's interesting because the classical period is the shortest period. The PowerPoint's only 11 slides. It focuses on 3 people and one major form, symphony form. But in that is probably the most important aspect of the introduction to music, because it is here that music comes of age in the classical period. It blends perfectly with the culture, with the scientific age, the age of reason, the age of freedom, the age of expression. And we don't change much after this. When we go into the Romantic period, you'll see that it is the classical age that opens the door for just literally thousands of composers. For the next 50 years or so after the classical age, you'll have early Romantic period. Then after that, you have what's known as the late Romantic period, where these people begin to express and experiment. You'll get guys like Wagner and Debussy in the late Romantic. And from there, we move into the 20th century, where you get some real crazy experimentation. But everything from here on will be based on classical musical ideas and form. Eventually, this will lead us, I'll do Romantic 2 weeks, 20th century is the 3rd week. 4th week will be popular music. That may be the end of our class. We may just have 4 more weeks, if I'm not mistaken, if we've got that, because Thanksgiving's in there, but that doesn't affect us a lot. But anyway, I wanted to throw this at you so you could see me. I know you miss me greatly, but so you can see what we're talking about, because I can't emphasize enough how important the classical period is. This classical period is where things really, like I said, come of age, form, music matures, and honestly, we have not moved much further than this in some of those areas. Now, when it comes to harmony and instrumentation, yeah, we're way out there because we got electronic instruments. We've experimented with new harmonies, but this is something I'm hesitant to say, but I might as well say it because I believe it. We're dealing with 3 composers. Haydn was a genius, but he was sort of a withdrawn, laid-back genius. Mozart was an incredible genius. He was off the farm. Had he lived, who knows what would have happened. But he died at 35. Now think about that. He started composing at 5 and dies 30 years later. And he's composed and wrote all his life. Pay attention to the video. It will surprise you and shock you. Beethoven comes along, and Beethoven actually composed, but he took a break in his life where he tried to raise his brother's son, which he claimed was his son, and that's a whole soap opera in itself. And he was temperamental. He was hard to get along with, and then when he went deaf, he was even worse to deal with. If you want to do some interesting reading, read about Beethoven. You probably won't like him because most people think, oh, he's the magnificent rebel. He was really a pretty lousy guy, personally. You know, he would throw stuff at people, curse people, would sit around naked writing music. He had an apartment, but he couldn't keep a housekeeper because she had run away. He called his brother's wife all kinds of names, took her to court, sued her, accused her of all kinds of indecent things, while he himself was trying to take his child, their child, not his child, but his brother and his wife's child. They were trying to raise him as a Christian. Well, Beethoven said, well, I'm going to raise him in the church, make him a moral person, while Beethoven himself was sleeping with his students, running around, beating the child, taking the child from his mother, almost forcing the kid to try to commit suicide one time. And he was not a very good person. It's amazing, the biography of it. They've made movies about it, but nobody's really done it justice because it's too big a story to tell. But that's just sort of the sidelight. I would encourage you during this next week, as you look at these people, take a little time and do a little reading about them. I think you'll be surprised. They're not at all what a lot of music teachers like to present, because I'm trying to present you with fact. A lot of music teachers, I had one in my master's degree program in music, worshipped Mozart. I criticized him one time. I almost failed a class because of it. I had to analyze one of his lesser known works, and it took 2 weeks, and it was just pure punishment from this professor who thought Mozart was just God on high. And when he sat me down in his office one day, he said, "You need to understand that we owe everything to Mozart." I said, "Well, there's some other great composers." Well, you don't tell that to some guy who's a Mozart scholar, but enough of that. I do have a lot of respect for him. His skill, his genius. I don't have a lot of respect for Beethoven or Mozart in their personal life. I think they were probably people I wouldn't want to hang around with, but enough said. That's what you're going to be looking at with this. Listen to the lecture. Well, I don't even call this a lecture. This is just an overview of this PowerPoint. But follow this. I'm going to post some videos. I have the Mozart biography. And then I think you'll breeze right through the test. It shouldn't be difficult at all. So I think you'll enjoy it. But if you don't, we've always got the romantic. So I'll be talking to you later about that. So long.